Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, is Mike Robinson, and we're joined today by Alex Thomson with Eastern Approaches. Alex reporting, of course, from the Netherlands. But we're going to start with a more human topic today, a man incarcerated in prison.
Yes, Eugene Lukjanenko. Alex, we've spoken about Eugene, I think it was mid-December or so. I just wanted to say, first of all, that he is on hunger strike at the moment. This is day 48 of his hunger strike today in prison. But Alex, if we just run through briefly the graphics that we showed in mid-December, just to get a feel for this story again, if you could take us through this.
Here is a campaigner's summary of Eugene Lukjanenko's hunger strike and how it began. And you will find several write-ups about this. In essence, someone took a liking to Mr. Lukjanenko's son, whom we're not going to be naming. Mr. Lukjanenko himself is a Ukrainian Jew by birth and origin, who became a citizen of the Netherlands and then moved on to Britain, but retained his Dutch citizenship. And his son was being brought up in Britain the last few years in Medway, a council area in Kent. For some reason, a liking was taken to his profitably adoptable or fosterable son, and the excuse given, which was accepted in court, I think meanwhile I'll be looking up the name of the judge because it's important to talk about that as well, but the argument successfully given by Medway Council Children's Services was that Mr. Lukjanenko was not a fit father and there was a risk of future emotional harm of Mr. Lukjanenko's son, because before Mr. Lukjanenko's own birth, Mr. Lukjanenko Sr., so the boy's grandfather, had been a Jewish victim of the Holocaust. And so Medway Council's case was that the boy had nothing bad to say about his father, and therefore it must be an abusive father-son relationship. And this was accepted by one of the new-style British judges in a non-jury family court in Britain.
This was the social worker involved, Anne Domini.
Yes, or Anne Domini. It appears that she has failed to file accounts, but here is her Manchester-based consultative services, the company through which she presumably bills for her so-called advice. And here is a particularly blood-curdling picture of her, Anne Domini. She's the subject of legal action by Mr. Lukjanenko, as I understand it. People may draw their own conclusions about her. There's a lot of material about her. We're deliberately not publishing any personal details, as it were, other than what's publicly listed. But I don't think so. That's her home address, so people shouldn't go and expect to find her there or anything. That's her business address.
People not interested in helping him, Ian Sutherland, Medway Director of Children and Adult Services. Your son will never come back home is the quote from him, and his Member of Parliament, Rahman Chishti. So just to put a picture of Eugene back on screen here now, this is not the typical candidate for somebody that you expect to have their child taken away from the state, Alex. This is an educated concert pianist, and you know, if we look at the type of people that are targeted by social services for this type of treatment, he doesn't fit the normal demographic.
No, he doesn't, but there is a sad truth coming out here, which is also being found by the victims of police brutality and various other kinds of postmodern state problems in Britain, is that having eaten up the lower classes, whom traditionally the British upper middle class has not cared two hoots about, they are now finding that the beast is coming to eat them. And so we've got, unfortunately, when it becomes a matter of Slavic, Eastern European people being involved, they tend to be very able to defend themselves, very verbally dexterous, and therefore a huge embarrassment, and also great strong campaigners, particularly someone of Jewish Ukrainian heritage who has seen how evil has worked in his own part of the world in the past. So this is a real problem, and it's not coincidental, I would say. We see this in the Netherlands, that children of at least some Slavic heritage are highly desirable for fostering and adoption because, well, at the hideous end, couples who are adopting with a view to abuse find these children very attractive, and at the longer tail of just parents who are foster parents who simply wish a child to adopt, they would much rather have a well-spoken, well-brought-up, non-disturbed, apart from having been stolen from the bosom of their own family, non-disturbed child, blonde-haired, blue-eyed type, than the various stages of dysfunctional brought-up children who are usually available for fostering. So the son of someone this high up is a prime asset, let's put it that way. You put on screen Mr. Ian Sutherland, the Director of Children's Services and Associated Nefariousness at Medway Council. You didn't. We didn't know at that stage, although I hadn't realised it. I should have done. That Mr. Sutherland, who said your son will never be coming back home, is married to Mrs. Ruth Sutherland, who is the National Director of a children's charity.
Okay. Now, just to bring people up to date, we've had an update, or you received an update yesterday on his case against Anne Dominey. He has taken a complaint with the Health and Care Professional Council, the HCPC, and his complaint apparently has met their what are being described as stringent fitness to practice requirements for considering complaints, and the complaint is currently being formally investigated. Now, I just had a brief look for Anne Dominey today at Medway Council and came across this document which she authored from the 25th of May 2016. This is the Children and Young People Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and as part of this document, she has a white paper, I guess you could describe it, the case for action. This is the final draft, published, it was again written in February 2016. And there was one that, well, point number one, which Brian absolutely grabbed my attention, because it said a strategically planned whole system approach with collaboration at all levels is vital to ensure a high performing approach, common purpose, and a shared culture of our young people rather than their young people is essential. And to me, Brian, when I looked at her profile on LinkedIn, what did I find? NLP, leadership, all this type of stuff. The language is there right in front of us, but this attitude that people are our young people, speaking as a social worker.
The children are ours. The children belong to us, and the us in this case is the state. This is big society with a vengeance. The children are not part of a family. They're not of the parents. They are simply there for the state. And of course, the Scottish Government has taken this a step forward because we can now see with the named person scheme that really parents are only seen as sort of caretakers of the children while they're growing up. They're really owned by the state, and if the state deems that the parents have made any mistakes or got anything wrong or are teaching their children the wrong things, the state says the wrong things, then those children can be simply taken away from the parents.
So Alex, just to end on this, just a reminder that this is day 48 of Eugene's hunger strike in prison. My understanding is that he is not terribly well at the moment at all. I think that he needs quite a lot of support here, and I think it would be fair to ask for that at this point.
Very much support needed. Letters to Eugene Lukjanenko in prison. His stage name is Yevgeny Soifertis, if people want to look up his recordings, Soifertis. But his real name, Eugene Lukjanenko, or his Ukrainian version of name, is what's used in this case. I've got the other two names here, by the way. People may wish to follow up with these people in a lawful and polite manner, as well as supporting Mr. Lukjanenko. The argument being made in court initially by Medway Council, by their court-appointed psychologist, that argument was made by a Melanie Gill, Gill, that anyone who was the son of a Holocaust survivor was going to be an abusive father. And the argument was made in a family court and accepted by a circuit judge named Veronica Hammerton. So those are the people involved. Without getting into detail about Mr. Lukjanenko's state, I think, Brian may wish to follow up on this in general terms. We have to say people shouldn't be afraid or surprised if they get some very emotional replies back from Mr. Lukjanenko. Some very awful and nasty things happen to people's minds when, certainly in this physically weakened state, but even when they're not on hunger strike, when they have been impelled to this extremity and are, as with Melanie Shaw, told, you may just about get to see your son again if you jump through all our hoops and keep stum. then that does terrible things to every one of the dozens of people whom UK Column has helped now with children caseload. And you'll never be the same person again. And the fight to preserve your sanity and perspective is almost an insuperable odds fight. So people shouldn't be surprised if they hear contradictory things and recriminations. And this is not a reason to stop supporting for, praying for, and advocating for Mr. Lukjanenko.
Absolutely, Alex. Thank you for that.
Okay, let's move on. And Alex, you've captioned this one. Why is Britain suddenly exposing France? This is from AFP, and the headline is Britain arrests French suspect in Sarkozy financing probe.
We are told that this is simply Britain following through on one of these awful corpus juris European arrest warrants. But I think there's always more to it politically than that, because there are mechanisms to avoid prosecuting people when it's embarrassing. In this case, we have an Arab of Swiss citizenship called Mr. Gerrish, well known to right-wing French politics. And he's thought to be the real owner of a French villa, which was put up for sale and which another Arab bought for 10 times its market value as apparently a way of sloshing funds through to Nicolas Sarkozy's presidential election or re-election bid. This would have been in the mid to late noughties. And this is another confirmation coming through to me that the takedown of Mr. Gaddafi is something like a 2000s version of the Suez crisis. What I mean by that is that France had its geostrategic objectives and it managed somehow, or the Israeli-French node managed to pull Britain and America with it, improbable as that may seem. It was Israel that set up, it was France that set up not the State of Israel, but its nuclear program at Dimona in the 50s, and did a sudden volte-face later and became more pro-Arab. But France does these switches from time to time. We know from reporting in the Cyprus Mail, for example, that France, in particular under Macron, is very interested in the North Africa, Eastern Mediterranean region and owning the infrastructure there through particularly the Total oil company. And so this is a reconfirmation to me of previous things we've heard through clandestine sources and semi-open ones as well, that actually it was Sarkozy who wanted Gaddafi with cold steel up him, and that it may have been a French DGSE operative or a paid agent of that intelligence service that did the dirty deed, and that the Brits and Americans were actually perhaps on a different page at that point, prepared to go along with this Sarkozy-led operation, but perhaps turning against it. Now they've realised that France is pulling in a different direction to Britain and America and Germany as the European superstate emerges. So that's my take on the matter, and I think that Britain is fighting something of a panicked rearguard action by suddenly exposing this.
So what is that different direction, Alex?
Well, here you can see something of what France is up to at the moment. Macron is on a 3-day visit to China to try to butter up Xi Jinping. This again is a kind of one-upmanship over President Trump for having recently visited and semi-promised that America would be interested in some parts of the One Belt, One Road initiative. Macron was in Xi'an, the sort of northwestern capital, main northwestern center of old China. So it's the place from which the Silk Route used to start out, because west of that was more or less desert. And Macron was there symbolically to say basically that France would be the western end of the infrastructure that would be developing from that point westwards. And effectively, and I've been hinting at this in my reports over the last few months, France is interested in taking on the Eurasian infrastructure and almost switching from an Anglo-American allegiance back to something like a Eurasian infrastructure model in a desperate attempt to preserve its prestige. And in the same vein, we see the French using their Saint-Cyr, CYR, officership school to invite Eastern European and North African officer cadres along to get Sandhursted, to replace the role that Sandhurst had in giving a British twist to officers of various nations in that zone. The French want to do this again now. So in the report on this, which France Culture, a national public channel, gave on Macron's visits to China, and they said that he was interested in reopening the Silk Route and making it a new Silk Route, and i.e. a Franco-Chinese Silk Route. The slide also had an image on the right there, which shows how China is attempting to literally circumvent India by setting up this string of pearls involving Burma, which is just to the right there, and then Bangladesh, where Chittagong Port is, and then Sri Lanka and the Maldives at the bottom of India, which have troubled relationships with India, particularly in naval terms, and ending in India's arch nemesis and China's new ally, Pakistan, on the Iranian border at Gwadar, just on the border away from Sistan and Baluchistan, which is the Sunni province of Iran, over which there's been so much upheaval recently because it's Sunni and ISIS has been trying to carve it off from the rest of Iran. You see that France and China have not really decided their relationship to the Anglo-American entity at the moment, shall we say. And the big question is what is the geographical node at the heart of this? It's Israel. Israel has very good relationships, deep ones, with both France and China, and particularly developing in the second half of the 20th century. And Israel is already a major player in One Belt, One Road. So it's not a question of whether One Belt, One Road is a good or bad initiative. It's a question of China wishing to circumvent the blockade, such as the Strait of Malacca blockade around Singapore, which have been effectively put on it. The South China Sea issue is a spin-off of that. China's determined to obviate that, to go around it in some way or other. And Macron, I think, has realised, being a smart cookie, that this is going to happen, and he better be in China's good books.
Okay, well, it's interesting you say that, because let's just look at what Macron actually said while he was with Xi Jinping. He said, first of all, that China has managed to lift 700 million people out of poverty in recent decades. This is true for France too, where we are confronted with mass unemployment, with the imperative need to give future prospects to a whole part of our population. But it is a challenge of the world that lives today in a crisis of globalized capitalism, which has in recent decades exploded social inequalities and concentration of wealth. And then he went on to say that the West needs to overcome unilateral imperialism. He said that we must draw the lessons of the past. Every time we tried to impose the truth or the law against the people themselves, we were wrong. And sometimes we have produced even worse situations, as in Syria or Libya today. We need to work together to develop the respect of sovereignty of the people. And he said there should be neither a disguised supremacy or a conflict between competing supremacies. All our art, if I may use that word, will not be the art of war, but an art of cooperation balanced in order to ensure the geostrategic, political and economic level, the harmony of our world needs. And he said that the West is tired of is a tired postmodern world where the great epics are forbidden. And he said, I think that the initiative of the New Silk Road can meet our interests because of France and those of France and of Europe. If we give ourselves the means to really work together, it's up to Europe and Asia, up to France and China to define and propose together the rules of a game in which we can all win or we can all lose. I have come thus to tell China my determination to have the Euro-Chinese partnership enter into the 21st century with this new grammar. We must all define together. And of course, there's a bit of translation in that, so that may not be the best translation. But nonetheless, this isn't the type of rhetoric that Alex, that I was expecting from someone that has come out of the Rothschild stable.
Well, the speeches of French presidents are notoriously opaque. The language is deliberately hard to understand, even in French, Mike. It's a nightmare for interpreters. But you're quite right that it's not typical Rothschild stuff. I think that Macron has proved to be bigger than the boots he was given, shall we say. He's outgrown the preordained role for him. I have to give him his due, and I saw this as soon as he was inaugurated. He actually does have the one foot in the banking world, so you'd expect him to be close to the Anglo-American Israeli system in that regard. But the other foot is this old-fashioned idea that whoever inhabits the Élysée Palace should stand for prestige and the gloire de la France. And he very much reminds me of Chirac in the late 90s, who, of course, got Tony Blair into the European Union military unification over the Saint-Malo Agreement, because he's the first president since Chirac to speak fluent English, to be somewhat anti-Israeli, to have this dialogue which goes back to Napoleon when he invaded the Levant, the dialogue of we are with the peoples of the Middle East, we understand Islam, and so on. And in this case, we understand the great prestige of China. Chirac, too, in his day, went to China and told students, learn French and see France as your the champion in the West of a multipolar world. I think it's a genuine decision by Macron and some of the deep state below him to flick a switch and to say, OK, the NATO era's over. Of course, they did a half step back from NATO under de Gaulle, and from the 60s to about 2000, they were not in NATO, but they didn't formally withdraw. But now they're formally doing that, I think, because if they don't, they see that the German-dominated military union will be something like a tool to hurl itself at Russia and ultimately China, and that's not what they want. They wish to continue to trade. That said, they are at the same time selling off some of their best assets, the French, such as Alstom, the railway sector of it has been sold to Siemens. So in some regards, the French capital conglomerate wants to be in bed with Germany, which is decided after the war because they got rolled over 3 or 4 times by the Germans within a century and don't want that to happen again. But the political deep state level, I think, has decided genuinely, and there were some trigger words in what you just said there, read from him, Mike, that indicate that he is putting out strong feelers to say to the Asians, please regard us as the acceptable alternative of the West. We're a friendlier face than the Anglo-Americans are. Whether it's genuine or not is a different matter, but that's the overture I see.
Well, indeed, that's the big question. But just 2 words on this, Alex, if you could. You said he had outgrown his banking roots. Isn't that what Putin did as well?
That is very much what Putin did, yes. I think the worst of the bankers tried to silence him, kill him, threaten him in the 93-94 timeframe, and then they realized they couldn't, and he spent a few years trying to build up an agreement that his domestic enemies would have a ceasefire, a truce with him, so that he could build up his power base with a bit of service to them. And then, when he was secure, he started having a go at the worst of the bankers in Russia, the oligarchs. So if Macron has been badly underestimated, and if he has an ounce of morals in him, he may possibly be preparing to do a kind of clean sweep in France as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, let's move on to the Netherlands. And, well, give us the background to this. This is a Dutch MP called Thierry Baudet.
Baudet.
Yeah, and you've said that the mainstream media has tacitly edited his tweet.
Yes, he went jogging and took a selfie and put it on Instagram, and this was used by RTL, which is a kind of Dutch equivalent of ITV. It's a multinational corporation, but this is the Dutch arm of RTL. It was used by them as illustration for their kind of low-quality article suggesting that Mr. Baudet and his party, the Forum for Democracy, were absentees from the chamber, that they were not taking part in debates. It's a hatchet job. And in support of it, they, in a font which suggests they copied and pasted and changed the font, on the left there, they started his tweet to illustrate the RTL4 article with, "I'm fed up with this tarnishing, etc." And what they did not show was the original tweet. And what I've boxed in red on the right was the full tweet, or rather the words which they omitted. And in bold underneath is my translation of what the RTL article omitted. And the words omitted were, "This was the parliamentary diary for the day on which I went jogging at 9:30 in the morning. Parliament only began sitting at 2 p.m. I'm a bit fed up with this tarnishing, etc., etc." It's a fairly extreme example of what the mainstream media will do to have a go at minor and new parties. In this case, I think particularly because this is the man who stood up in borrowed combat fatigues in the chamber late last year and said to the minister, who then had to resign, the Minister of Defence, "Why are you supplying our men with substandard kit?"
And he's also an anti-EU military unification MP.
Yes, he won't use the terminology yet of EU military unification. All of the smaller parties, people are trying to work on their understanding, but they haven't quite got it yet. But they're all they're saying is they won't go as far as EU military unification. Some of them will say, "Is it right that we put some units under German command?" But they won't go the whole hog and see it as a pan-European project. But Baudet is vehemently anti-EU. And even at the Oxford Union in English, he makes a very good case against the EU. But there he is, on the right, you showed a picture of him pouting, which was another carefully chosen shot by RTL to suggest that he was just a boy who throws tizzies and doesn't have much to say. So this is carefully crafted stuff. And I think it has to do with responding to his dawning understanding as a very popular party. In the polls, he's now number 2 in the polls, although he only has 2 out of 150 seats. But if he were a general election tomorrow, he would perhaps be the opposition party. He's that strong. So I think this is a way of getting at him before he says too much about EU military unification.
Well, clearly the criticism of EU military unification is affecting the mainstream, because here's Foreign Policy magazine with a fantastic headline here: "No, Europe isn't ambushing NATO." And the subheadline is "How to Learn to Stop Worrying and Love the EU's New Security and Defence Agreement." And they say, "Don't tell the European Union it's falling apart. While doubters obsess about Brexit, Greece's relationship with the Eurozone, and nationalist parties across the 28 members, the continent's bold political experiment is just getting bolder." And it goes on to say, European Council President Donald Tusk has hailed PESCO as the materialisation of a more than half a century old dream of European defence cooperation. German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel explained, according to Politico, that the EU spends 50% as much on as the United States on defence, yet only has 15% of its military efficiency. And they say that PESCO is not quite the EU army that the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker called for in 2015. Rather, it's a binding treaty-based framework aimed at formalising defence and security cooperation between EU member states and through projects and commitments. So they're downplaying it, and they end up by saying, but at least as it stands now, PESCO is far from a NATO slayer. There is a good chance that with proper implementation and the discovery of greater efficiencies between EU nations, it has a modest role to play. And the reason for its modesty is simple. There is only one thing that PESCO and the EU lack that is central to to NATO success, the United States. Look, this is a whitewash article, Brian, and they of course are right to say that PESCO is not an EU army. And they're right to say that it's not a NATO slayer, but they absolutely understate the reality. PESCO, as we know, is only one part of one string of the military unification bow. And at the Bratislava summit of September 2016, EU leaders decided to give, as they describe it, a new impetus to the European external security and defence by strengthening EU cooperations in the area, and that included not just PESCO, but also launching a coordinated annual review in defence, which is called CARD, setting up a military planning and conduct capability to improve crisis management structures, and of course strengthening the EU's rapid reaction toolbox, including the EU battle groups and civilian capabilities. So PESCO is only one part of this, Brian, and the Foreign Policy magazine aims to downplay that.
Well, I think that's the key part of the article, Mike, that they are very worried about the amount of information about the reality of EU military unification. So you've got to have these articles to try and downplay what's happening. Yeah. It's exactly that.
And in the meantime, Alex, the US Navy is heading for the Crimea.
Yes, I know we have a full agenda, but Brian might want a few seconds' thought on the state of play with the US Pacific fleet in the Western Pacific, with a number of awfully bungled operations. Now, there's a level of training problem with that as they continue to posture off the coast of China and hem China in the South and East China Sea. But there's also an element of suggestion that they have been denied Russian and Chinese Pacific waters through the use of what seems to be a new generation of electronic countermeasures, in which Iran also seems to have been involved, because they have now been able to, through their so-called Houthi rebels, they've now been able to share that technology to the extent that warship attacks are unsuccessful on the Houthis. So that possibly explains it. But anyway, US warships have done what they did in the eve of the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, which is go into the Black Sea. Now, the Bosphorus, which is the straits through Istanbul, as international waters regulated by treaty. And if you go to Istanbul, you'll see these quite frightening warships and container ships going through day and night, because it's international, even though it's a few dozen yards from Turkey's biggest city shore. But they've gone through this, exercising their right to do so. And the only thing in the Black Sea which is, of interest, now that Georgia is not really likely to start a war again, is Crimea, which is, of course, now reverted to Russian territoriality. And the quote I put on screen there was interesting, which is that when a chap was asked at the Naval War College, a strategy professor no less, called Jim Holmes, why this was going on, you can read the quote in your own time, he basically suggested we have to be rattling the Russians' cage day and night, otherwise they will, with their arguments, win over Western public opinion. So we have to continually harry them, seems to be what the line he's taking.
Okay, you raised a number of points there. We haven't got time in today's news, but yes, it's clear that there's something badly wrong with the quality, really, of men and women in the American Pacific Fleet. We've had collisions, we've had ships going aground, too many. There's once or twice, okay, that's a coincidence, but we're seeing something significant happening. And we know that American admirals and retired senior officers are pointing a finger and saying there's something going wrong with our training. That's a nice lead into a segment we've got in the news in a couple of minutes, where we're talking about what's happening in the British Army. So trouble with the training, but yes, you're also right that it's clear that the Russians have introduced technology which has really caught the Americans by surprise, of which jamming is a key part. But we'll have a go at putting in a detailed slot on that subject in another news program. Let's just bring in this very quickly to show that, of course, the Russians are still those nasty Russians. This is from a few days ago, Wall Street Journal, and the headline, "A Russian Ghost Submarine, Its US Pursuers and a Deadly New Cold War." I had to say I laughed at this, Mike, because what's really going on is that the Russians have had a diesel-electric submarine operating in the Mediterranean, and it's caused the Americans major problems. So they've got an aircraft carrier, according to this article, they've got an aircraft carrier, George H.W. Bush, they've got Seahawk helicopters, they've got P-8 Poseidon aircraft flying out of Italy trying to find this submarine. Why do I find this amusing in a serious sense? Because, of course, diesel-electric submarines, when they're operating on batteries, very difficult to find. But Britain got rid of all its diesel-electric submarines some years ago, selling off the last of those submarines to the Canadians.
So are they significantly quieter than nuclear submarines? Then?
Oh, absolutely. There's no comparison. If you have a diesel-electric submarine running on batteries, it's essentially silent. That's not so with a nuclear submarine. That's a discussion we can have at another time. But of course, what they're really saying is that the Russians operating normally, but this is now seen as a deadly new Cold War, which of course is propaganda. But here's the state of Britain's military. The BBC and other news outlets today covering this article, "New army adverts promote emotional support for recruits." So a couple of weeks ago, we had that the army was no longer going to use adverts saying, "Be the best, join the best army, join the British Army." That's all gone. And we've now got something which is saying that basically you can come and join the army because you'll get the emotional and physical support you need. Now, I've put at the bottom of that, it fits in with the head of the Army, General Sir Nick Carter's mantra of maximising people's talent and regardless of background. I picked up on that statement because, of course, we've warned about this. But let's remember it's Capita that's actually doing the recruitment in partnership with the Army. I called Capita this morning to say, would they like to comment on what's being reported? But their press team have no contact with staff inside Capita, so they had no idea who's running this recruitment partnership. They couldn't give me a name, so I finished the conversation. But let's remember that this company's been failing to meet recruitment targets, and now it's involved with this very squidgy advertising role. Don't worry if you're a bit weak and need a bit of emotional support, you can get it from the British Army. Here's their particular division for recruiting soldiers. They're recruiting themselves, and this is quite amusing because you can see them trying to encourage people to come in as suitable people to recruit people in the armed forces. This is mind-boggling stuff because, of course, unless they've served, they have no idea of what the job really entails. But this is the main point. Here's General Sir Nicholas Carter, and we showed a little while ago that he was using extremely strange newspeak. He said the army was going to change, evolve. It was going to be not revolution, but evolution. He said that the army was now going to work as a business model. So he's talking about efficiency, productivity. I don't know what that means, Mike, but it's an interesting one. Prosperity, communication, within the goldfish bowl of scrutiny. Now, I don't think this language is laughable. I think this is very serious. I think something has been done to this man's mind. This was the one that brought it all together, fusing all the available levers of national power against multiple audiences to deliver successful outcomes. Following the forces review, I'm implementing my big idea, integrated action. What does that actually mean? No idea. And he goes on, he talks about non-kinetic change behavior by non-kinetic means, soft rather than hard. This man, Alex, is telling us that something very strange is going on with the army. And we had Sir Andrew Pulford doing exactly the same thing with the RAF, using this newspeak. So we know that there's something strange going on, and we're going to give credit to Deborah Haynes from the Times, because she tweeted out today and actually asked in the tweet what people thought about this new advert. So she was so puzzled about it, she asked, what is this about? Well, I sent her a direct message back and said, well, the first place you should look is the relationship between the British Army and Common Purpose. This is one document which I've selected showing Common Purpose getting into military army bases in order to peddle their type of leadership. And here's the quote from Common Purpose: "We think leaders who can work across these boundaries are more likely to solve problems and create change." So there is immense proof of Common Purpose getting into the military structure. And of course, what has Common Purpose been doing, using NLP to change the way people see their own organisations?
Before we get Alex's comment on this, Brian, the thing that struck me with what that guy said at the beginning was that they are aiming to make the best of everyone's talents. Now, everyone has, from all kinds of different backgrounds, have different talents. Would you put somebody that's been trained as an army interrogator into a hospital to help people with mental illness problems?
Not necessarily.
No.
What you're saying is people can have very big talents in one area, but in other areas, if you look at them as a rounded person, they have big problems. You can't use them. It's not the army's job to say, well, you've got a talent here, we are going to covet you in these other areas in order to get you to be able to serve. This is nonsense.
Well, exactly. So what becomes of an organisation when you put somebody that's ill-suited into a particular role?
It's going to cease to function.
Right.
It's going to cease to function. So we can see the cuts in the equipment. This is the attack on the actual fabric of the army, so that recruiting is already down. We can't recruit enough people. Now we're attacking the quality of the people in the British Army.
Alex, any thoughts?
Yes, I think that someone in the chat room has already said it, that General Sir Nick Carter is harder to understand than Homer's Odyssey in the original, which, by the way, I've got here off my shelf, but rather impenetrable language. The thing is that if it gets to the army, then the rot has set in very deep. I saw the RAF high top brass talking this way a decade ago at GCHQ, and the same has happened with the US Air Force. There, the soft stuff starts there, and then it moves to the naval air wings, has done on both sides of the Atlantic. And if it gets to the stage of the actual grunts and Marines talking like this, or their commanders, as they now are, Major General Rob McGowan of the last Commandant General of the Royal Marines was another practical example of this. He's a shill for the EU. Then the rot has really set in very deep. What we've seen from the US, because they're 20 years ahead of the curve on this military undermining, is that feminism, third wave feminism, has a lot to answer for, because there's a great demand for women who've got no desire to do grunt work to get a secure career and not to be sniffed at is all the benefits, the fringe benefits that come from being in the army, hunky men around, and of course secure jobs and nice pay and secondary benefits. So if they wish to fill all the desk jobs, then the experienced men who've served their time in the field coming back to do the analysis are going to have to make way back out to be fat cannon fodder to satisfy the large number of young women of no particular skills who wish to be in the desk jobs. So it's a very good way of destroying, as David Ellis would say, destroying the brand of the British military and providing a number of sinecures for an important constituency as well.
Okay, we need to have more discussion on this, because of course these tactics are not just happening in the military, they're certainly happening inside the NHS, they're happening inside local government. We're seeing a massive change in the way people think and behave. Let's hop over to this man for the moment, and the BBC here reporting that Peter Sutherland, well, they say former Irish Attorney General, has died at the age of 71. We're interested because this, of course, was the man being used by the United Nations as their special representative for migration. And he's the man who said that basically Europe needed more migration so as to break down the the nation state effectively inside Europe. So this man has died. Let's just remember that he had huge involvement at very high level. This was the June 2013 Bilderberg meeting, and there he is, bottom left, Peter Sutherland. He had his Goldman Sachs banker hat on there, but of course he's mixing with the great and the good of British government, David Cameron, Ken Clarke, George Osborne. No minutes taken, so the public no idea what went on in the minutes. But that man saying migration in Europe, very good thing for breaking down the nation state. And then following that Bilderberg meeting, Ken Clarke said, well, absolutely no conspiracy on the Bilderberg meeting. But if we end up saying we're going to quit the EU, then David Cameron has got to go. Presumably that was a decision made by the Bilderberg group, Mike.
Quite possibly. Okay, just briefly on Syria here. We now have the situation that the Syrian army is making progress in Idlib. This is the last bastion, I suppose, of terrorist extremism in Syria. In this video, the Syrian army can be seen in the towns of Sirah, Siri, Harmaleh and Al-Jaman. And all four of these towns are located in Idlib, in the eastern countryside of the Idlib governor. Now, why are we mentioning this? Well, we'll come on to the BBC in a second, but before we do, we'll mention Fort Ross here, who have made the statement that perhaps there's a false flag coming for Idlib Province, and they're asking, will it be a chemical weapons false flag? And why are they saying that? It's because, well, a page has been established already for campaigners. It's on Google. It's there with links for people to just click on the link and tweet. If you're logged into Twitter, it will automatically create a tweet for you. You only have to hit the enter key and away it goes. And the hashtag is going to be outrage for Idlib, apparently. Now, this is unconfirmed, so I don't know whether this is actually leading to anything or in preparation of anything, but I'm just putting it out there in case it is, because that's pretty unpleasant if that's the case. Well, as I say, it's not implausible. Now, Lise Doucette, who is the darling of BBC Radio 4 and BBC Radio, was on the Radio 4 Today programme this morning, decrying the Syrian army's move into Idlib. She said it's going to be a new humanitarian disaster. She said that Assad is carrying out this military effort to reclaim Syrian territory, apparently against the wishes of Russia and Iran, is her claim. She's promoted Turkish calls for a de-escalation zone in Idlib. And of course, you know, I'll just to try to put this in a bit of context, aside from the fact that ultimately Turkey wants to annex that piece of land, in the meantime, of course, Turkey wants a de-escalation zone there because they want to keep the people that are there and not in Turkey. They know who's there. They know that it's all the terrorists that Assad gave safe passage out of other areas of Syria that are all gathered there. He doesn't want, Erdogan doesn't want those people in Turkey. And Lise Doucette went on, well, she did begrudgingly slip into a report that this part of Idlib is largely controlled by so-called rebel groups that are Al-Qaeda affiliated. That was just for a split second. I think she probably hoped that nobody would notice. This, I think, is setting itself up for another potential chemical weapons claim in the not too distant future. In the meantime, in Damascus itself, there are some of the West Darling rebels in East Ghouta firing mortars across into Damascus yesterday. Vanessa Bailey was telling me about this this morning. Quite a number of mortars sent over, and damage to taxi ranks, damage to churches, damage to shops. It just continues with the sort of people that are left behind, Brian. But I'm, I suppose, particularly concerned about the possibility that they are intending to ramp up pressure over Idlib, and perhaps we see...
well, desperate measures when the West, US, UK find that their policy overseas isn't working. So desperate measures. I think this is certainly possible. Should we take this one, or should we jump back to Soros?
No, we don't have time for Soros today.
Okay, we've only got a minute or so remaining. We'll do this one very quickly. But this was actually last week. I picked up on the BBC here. This was part of their website. It was talking about human trafficking, and I paid attention to this. We've covered it on UK Column News over several editions, but this was the screenshot. And it appeared that the BBC was finally starting to pay attention to what's really going on with people trafficking around the world. But the big inset video, which I've just taken some screen grabs of, talking about the trade in humans, it says that more than 18,000 people are victims worldwide. That sounds an amazingly small number,
Yeah,
Mike.
but that was 2014.
Okay. It's saying that biggest group from the UK. So it's pointing a finger at UK and the trafficking, mentioning 4,000 people. There's not a lot of detail here. You notice that this whole thing is printed on skin, but
that's quite unpleasant, really.
It is very unpleasant. But really what this is an advert for the BBC's McMafia series. So this is nothing to do with a proper BBC investigation into people trafficking. This is an advert. This is using it as an advert for their own material. And I found this particularly sickening. And it once again shows where the BBC is in the world. I think it's time this organisation was stopped, is my personal opinion. Alex, we've got quite a bit of material we haven't had time to cover. We'll have a look to get that into another slot. Anything you'd like to close on very quickly?
Just that I think that the media battle, as you've alluded to there, Brian, really is the key to all the others, because we cannot fight what we do not know about. We've covered a lot of disturbing things today, as usual, but we don't do it for no purpose. We do it to equip people mentally, and we do it in spite of an increasing amount of censorship, which Mike was talking about on last Sunday's Sunday Wire on 21stcenturywire.com. YouTube, Facebook and Google are attempting very much, Twitter to a lesser extent, to shut us out of the debate. It is for reasons like what you just alluded to. It's to do with shaping what people's consciousness is of the events in the world around them and even inside their own bodies and minds these days. So we very much need to win the media battle before we can address any of the others.
Absolutely right. Thank you for that. Well, I'll just say that we've got another lady who's facing court tomorrow as a result of trying to help in a particularly unpleasant child abuse case. That was the Hampstead ritualistic abuse. And I understand that Sabine McNeil is due in Lambeth Court tomorrow, but I haven't got any details of exactly which court or time. I'll see if I can get some detail about that. But Sabine has been put in prison over the last few months. I understand she's been released on bail, but now got to attend court again. But this is a lady not involved in violence or any unpleasant behaviour, simply that she's attempted to speak out and tell the truth about that Hampstead abuse case. I'll also say thank you very much to the donation that was received this morning from Bristol. Thank you for that. And just a final comment, I can see in our chat room that one or two people are talking about doing NLP courses. And I'll just say very gently, remember, of course, that if you go on a course to learn NLP, you are putting yourself forward to be NLP'd as you learn the material. So this is an interesting conundrum, and I would encourage people to think about how they protect themselves from NLP while they go on a course to learn it. And let's remember that the origins of NLP largely from Grinder and Banda, with associations through to the CIA and Israeli security services. That's it for today. Thank you very much for joining UK Column News. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.